In the aftermath of the War of Unification, Terra still bore deep scars of the age. Irradiated wastelands, poisoned seas reduced to toxic sludge, and continents scarred by thermonuclear fire and all manner of warp-tainted alchemical weapons. Its population was ravaged by mutation, famine, and endless tribal warfare among the techno-barbarian warlords. But for the first time in living memory, a long quiet would settle across the wasteland. The Emperor envisioned the foundation of a galactic empire, but first there was work to do, as uniting Terra under his Golden Raptor banner was only step one. Now come along here as we take a dive into what the Emperor's basically been doing in the interim between the Unification War and what would become the Great Crusade. This video will be more of a logistics-oriented video, but that is to paint you the picture of just what manner of greatness that Big E has managed to wrest back for humanity. Anyways, let's begin. Like any leader, king, or monarch of any age, the Emperor understood that humanity requires a symbol to gather around, a representation of the greatness to which they should aspire, and as such, while reforming civilization, one of the very first things that would be built would be the Imperial Palace. He would choose the greatest mountain range of ancient Terra, known in forgotten legends as the Himalayas. This would be the foundation for what would be the greatest building ever to be made in the galaxy. These colossal peaks, once called the roof of the world, would become the bones not only for sturdiness and the symbology, but also because they within laid many secrets that the Emperor wished to keep. Within these mountains laid ancient vaults where the Emperor had stored artifacts and technology from his vast life. But when he had found this place, it was not empty, and within laid the abandoned stronghold of an ancient order called the Sigillites. This order is an order of relic keepers and wardens of ancient arcane and somewhat technological secrets which were simply too dangerous for humanity to use or be victim of. And the Emperor gained a friend here, or maybe even had this friend from before the time, it's not really stated, but it is his true friend Malcador, the last Sigillite. Custodian Helidor stood atop a shattered ridge of the ancient Himalayas, his Ormite armor gleaming like molten gold beneath the sickly rat-scarred skies. Below him, billions toiled. Gene-bulk laborers and endless columns of servitors drove adamantine pilings deep into the planet's mantle, while the Earth itself groaned under the esoteric geoengineering of the Emperor's magi. The first foundations of the Imperial dungeons were being sunk into the old Sigillite vaults. Cold, forgotten halls where dangerous secrets has been slumbering for millennia. A tremor shook the works, a rival Masonic guild still clinging to their old grudges. They had sabotaged a material sorcerer's lift. Rock and scaffolding plummeted towards a crowded labor camp. Helidor moved like a bolt of lightning. He seized a fallen girder midair, muscles straining against its colossal weight, and yet he hurled it aside before it could cross dozens. The saboteurs were quickly found moments later, and quietly removed by himself and his brothers. No decree was needed. The custodian's presence alone reminded all that unity was no longer optional. For building the palace, the Emperor had summoned the artisans masters of terrors that had survived. Rival brotherhoods of architects, stone shapers, void rites, and material sorcerers would once serve the warring factions, but now would serve him. They worked ever on. No expense was spared, no material too rare, and no labor too vast. Billions of workers were conscripted, be it, as I mentioned before, gene-enhanced laborers or servitors by the untold millions, technomagi, and even the Emperor's own custodians that would participate mainly in roles of oversight. entire generational line would work on constructing just individual parts of the palace, and the guilds and builder factions with their ancient feud were told, commanded, and in some cases just encouraged to set aside everything for following this imperial decree, and those who continued to be a problem would see themselves quietly being removed by the overseeing custodies. The palace grew block by gilded block, showing it as a statement of unity, regal, elegance, and eternal. This construction was no mere engineering project, but a continental transformation. These monstrous peaks of the Himalayas were reshaped. Their roots were driven deep into the planet's mantle with adamantine pillars and esoteric, almost arcane geoengineering that made the earth itself groan as it was remolded. Entire valleys were filled or leveled, and entire ranges of smaller mountains were incorporated as natural bulwarks and foundations for future defensive works. Towers and spires clawed upwards, kilometers high, piercing the poisoned sky and eventually breaching the upper atmosphere, where macrohabs and void dogs would come to interface with future orbiting plates. Below the surface of the Earth, the sublevels would dwell miles into the bedrock, forming labyrinthine dungeons, crypts, catacombs, and powered vaults where the Emperor's projects and secrets would lay hidden. From orbit, the emerging structure appears as a handcrafted landmass rather than a singular building. Interconnected cyclopean pyramidal and monolithic forms of gold, silver, marble, adamantine, and psi-reactive crystalline alloys. Every wall place would be an artisan's and an artificer's life's work, and every single one of them would become to be studded with defense batteries, void shield projectors, and gun citadels every few 100 meters. Landing pads for shuttles, gunships, and even titans would in the future come to call this place a resting place. Decades later, the outer palace would rise in splendor. The Eternity Wall and Saturnine Wall now cloud skywards, their bastions clad in precious metals and carved with frescoes of the Emperor's victories. Helidor patrolled the growing continent of stone and gold, his spear resting easily in one hand. Artisan masters from rival guilds now finally worked side by side, their ancient feuds silenced by imperial decree and the quiet vigilance of the Legio Custodes. Helidor had ended more than one accident himself, and a loose keystone here or a rival's missing plan there, but today he oversaw the raising of the Lion's Gate. As he was gazing upon this work, an old void ride, ancient and proud, approached him. "Lord Custodian, my sons and their sons will never see this gate finish. Is the labor worth it?" Helidor looked down at the mortal. His voice was resonant and calm, and he informed this builder that what they made here would be eternal, and that his bloodline's toil would be remembered when the stars themselves would bow down before terror. For more than 2 centuries, the work proceeded, with sections still under construction even as the Great Crusade would begin to rage across the stars. The very first phase of the Imperial Palace would be called the Imperial Dungeon and was the collection of ancient and expanded sigilite fortresses, the Emperor's personal vaults, and the crypt where things, as I mentioned before, too dangerous would have to be put. Then rose the walls and the outer palace. Artisan masters and guild overseers competed in achieving the height of splendor of what would be possible with human skill, cladding bastions in precious metal and carving the frescoes that depicted the Emperor's victories and the dream of galactic dominion. Enormous plazas, hab blocks and administrative spires and spaceports, like the Lion's Gate, took shape and created an outer shell for the entire area. the Outer Palace became a teeming continent-spanning city in its own right, housing the burgeoning Adeptus Terra's bureaucracy. Civilian petitioners and guards, and even those who would work within the support infrastructure. Its defenses would consist of multiple walls, such as the Eternity Wall, the Ultimate Wall, Saturnine Wall, the Daylight Wall, each with a gate like the Helios, Indicus, Annapurna, and Kushito, all erected to stand against all that may come and to proclaim the glory of humanity. Beyond this bulwark, the inner palace coalesced around the ruins of an ancient Terran city that had been hidden within the Himalayas, and that would be called, and let's see if I can pronounce this, Kathmandu. As you might remember that in the Techno-Barbarian videos, this is where a lot of people got imprisoned. This sanctum was built to be much more restricted, and its security was the exclusive domain of the Legio Custodes. Here, beauty and lethality intertwined. Serene gardens became erected here, halls of impossible geometry and vaults containing mankind's greatest relics. Here, the construction was slower and more deliberate, since it was guided by the Emperor's own vision and was kept to so high standards that entire new ways and methods of construction would be made for this purpose alone. The architecture was interwoven with psi-reactive wards and inlaid with anti-warp sorcery down into the very bones of the sanctum. Helidor guarded the approach to a half-finished garden sanctum, where the crystalline alloys had started to hum with latent power. A technomagus had grown arrogant, attempting to peer too deeply into forbidden sigillite lore that had been unearthed during the digging. The man's mind had begun to fracture under the echoes. The custodian found him raving and gently, yet inescapably escorted him away. "Knowledge has its guardians," Helidor said simply. "You are not one of them." Later, a silent servitor skull carved impossible geometries into the marble, and Helidor stood motionless. He felt the Emperor's distant regard upon the work. The inner palace would not be merely strong, it would be sacred. Throughout all of this, the Emperor walked among the builders from time to time, where his presence would inspire awe and terror in equal measure. Builders and servants would weep and celebrate every time a section was finished, and so euphoric was the dream of seeing this construction done to the glory of mankind that it would become basically a festival every single time, with the Emperor himself quite often in attendance. Doing all of this work, however, the Emperor was no mere golden figurehead that would take long walks and wave at construction workers. Because with the memories of the failures that he had seen within the golden age of technology, and with all of his experience from having walked the annals of history alongside of humanity, he would consolidate all administrative and political power within an organization that he personally rode alongside his good friend Malcador. It would be called the Council of Terra. This mortal-led organization would direct all political and logistical decisions, basically allowing humanity to slowly becoming self-governed again, but this time it would be within a philosophical and legal framework created by the Emperor and Malcador. This would allow him to step away from being an active governmental figure and redirect his focus into the next phase of expanding the might of humanity. But for that to even begin, he would have to cleanse humanity. Even before full unification, Big E, with his cadre of scientists, had written and created a program for stabilizing and purifying the human genome. Radiation, viral plagues, generational exposure to chemical environments, and even, a certain cardinal that had some very interesting ideas about human purity. All of this had created basically a humanity that had been twisted so far away from what it originally was that he simply had to step in. He would grab a hold of a few remaining bloodlines that was pure enough to be treated and use them as a baseline for humanity. And now, under Imperial edict, widespread genetic screenings began and medical corrections was used when possible, and unfortunately, culling of the worst bloodlines that had been mutated too far would be performed. All within the goal of restoring a baseline humanity, but also making them stronger, purer, and free of the most hereditary flaws that had been plaguing them for quite a while, so that the species could once again claim its destiny among the stars. Reconstruction of the ruined city and the rest of the planet was a Herculean task, to put it mildly. The Emperor oversaw the clearing of rubble from ancient battlefields where cybernetic and mutated legions had been killing each other for generations. He oversaw the demolition of techno-barbarian fortresses where horrible techno-arcane experiments were commonplace. All of this to lay the foundation for something new. Vast Manufactorum rose up using all manner of salvaged parts from the Dark Age of technology and the Emperor's very own knowledge, and all of this would eventually lead to humanity starting to learn how all of this worked again. And he would start creating houses of scholars and archives using preserved fragments of knowledge that had survived this terrible time. Efforts were even made to heal the biosphere and were somewhat partially successful, seeing artificial bodies of water being able to sustain ecology and even some animal species. However, Terra would never be able to hold any sort of true biodiversity ever again. Year by year, a hive-like structure and fortified settlement replaced the anarchic shantytowns of the warlords, and slowly, with the new vision of order and rational progress, every citizen, every resource was directed towards the greater goal. Vast adamantine conduits and rune-edged ways flooded throughout the living rock. Monasteries and forges bustled within. At the heart of the emerging chamber of the Astronomicon, 10,000 seeds waited for future souls. Helidor watched the final focusing crystals being lured into place, their psi-reactive surfaces shimmering. A young custodian, if such a thing was even possible, relatively newly elevated a few hundred years ago, stood beside him. He asked, "Will this ever be finished?" But Helidor's gaze simply remained fixed on the mountain summit. He said that this palace is not stone and gold alone, that it is the Emperor's will made manifest, and we will never come to see it finish. We will simply view it begun, and we will always stand ready. An absolute wonder created by the Emperor's hands and untold laborers would be that of the Astronomicon. A nearby mountain close to that of Mount Everest was chosen as its location, and here humanity, under the guidance of Big E, created what is essentially a combination of an enormous mountain-sized cathedral and a psychic lighthouse. Among regular people, this place would be called the Hollow Mountain, as the entire structure is both the top of the mountain but also everything within it. Vast networks of adamantine conduits, crystalline resonators, and rune-edged focusing arrays thread throughout the entire thing, channeling and amplifying the energy upward and outward. This place is a self-contained world of monasteries, training hall, fortress, and defense batteries, completely self-sustained and isolated, able to weather threats on the level of the Imperial Palace itself. At its heart lies the chamber of the Astronomicon, a truly titanic, completely spherical vault. The lower hemisphere here is carved deep into the living rock of the mountain, while the upper half forms a vast dome, visible as a monumental structure atop the peak. The entire surface of this colossal sphere is lined with exactly 10,000 seed, each one facing inwards towards the center. In the absolute center of this chamber floats a blazing ball of psychic energy, raw, roiling, and released by the Chosen as they channel the minds into the machine. This seething orb is the focal point for this psychic lance of light that pierces throughout the warp, allowing for future starships to navigate this turmoiling place. The entire structure was in constant use up until the culmination of what would be the Horus Heresy, and one would have to consider that the Emperor was capable of keeping this structure active himself remotely, more or less by channeling his own power into it. Yeah, there's a lot of stories that really undercut how powerful the Emperor is at this point, and the thing is, he's gonna get even more powerful. Anyways, all were according to plan, but that was up until this very point. Everything had been set up. Terra was rebuilt, the glory of humanity was secured, and the next step was to reclaim the stars and unite the remnants of humanity. However, this would have to wait as the sons of the Emperor had been stolen away. And in the next video, we're going to explore this very thing. But for now, thank you so much for listening, and I will see you in the next one. Bye bye!